Last Thursday was my first time ever getting knocked out. My friend said I got dropped twice, but I don't remember the second one. The Acacia Strain had a show at the Ace of Cups in Columbus. Me and my friend Tanner are on the edge of the pit, and there's this dick making circles, swinging and windmill kicking the ring of people forming the walls of the pit. People that obviously don't want to mosh, or else they'd be in there kicking and swinging. I hate those kinds of people at shows. Hated them before this incident, hate them even more now. The building was packed, making it impossible for me to just scoot backwards. Courteous moshers respect the fist-out barrier. This dick was not. I never got his name, so I'll start calling him Richard, so this won't get flagged for how many times I reference him. The Acacia Strain were only a few songs in when Richard made his way back around to our part of the circle, still jumping backwards into people on the outskirts with haymakers and Chun-Li spin kicks. I see him coming, and I have my arm stretched out. But Richard chose not to respect the unwritten rule others abide by. I was told he'd made solid contact with his elbow to my chin. Tanner could hear the crunch over the blaring music. My eyes rolled into the back of my head, but I don't collapse because of how packed the room is. My body couldn't fall anywhere. The last thing I remember is putting my arm out. Tanner told me my eyes roll back forward, and I tried going after the guy before he could stop me. It didn't end well. What I remembered next was the medic asking me questions outside. I couldn't breathe through my nose, and it felt like a bowl of water was sloshing in my head. I'd also lost a tooth. It was bad enough that they decided to take me in the ambulance to the hospital. This is where my memories differ from what Tanner tells me. When we got into the ambulance, I remember seeing another woman in there, dressed in street clothes. What I thought at the time was that she'd also been hurt at the show. But Tanner says it was just he and the medic sitting back there with me, and the medic was a dude. I swear, though, I could describe this woman perfectly. I was conscious the whole trip. At one point, we made eye contact. Tears had smeared makeup down her cheeks. Her hair was long, straight black. Her eyes were also black, like she was wearing those colored contacts from Hot Topic. She was hauntingly beautiful, so much so that I instantly became self-conscious, knowing I'd just gotten the shit kicked out of me. I probably wasn't in the right vibe to be talking game to this girl. She also didn't look like she was in the right space for that either. I tried to stop myself from turning and gazing up at her, instead trying to focus on Tanner and the medic talking guitars. I was disappointed by my own cowardice for not even introducing myself. She wasn't in the ER waiting room, and believe me, I searched. That's when Tanner was like, "What are you doing?" And I say, "Trying to find the girl who rode up here in the ambulance with us." He made a confused expression, but his eyebrows were raised like, uh-oh. He might have been hit a little harder than I thought. I didn't believe him when he told me that there was no one in the ambulance with us. I went as far as going to the front desk and asking if a girl matching my description had checked in right before me. I explained she'd taken the same ambulance as us, but the woman said no. It was a slow night, and the waiting room was practically empty. To this day, I still question if she was real or not. I could smell her perfume, feel the pressure of someone's knees leaned up against the side of the stretcher. I don't know. It all felt pretty real. I know most people usually get excited about concerts, but I'm just not a fan. I've got pretty sensitive hearing, and crowds make me claustrophobic. But I still tried it once. I went to a Nirvana concert in Seattle when I was 20, and I almost didn't make it out alive. Having never been to a concert before, I guess I was expecting seats, but I would learn that we would just be standing in a large crowd of people in the middle of the floor. I don't remember much about the actual performance either. My best friend was supposed to go with her boyfriend, but they broke up a few days before the concert. She was pretty upset, and I agreed to go with her. I do love Nirvana, so I figured I could suck it up and go for her sake. Not 15 minutes into being there, my friend's ex found us. He managed to find a friend with an extra ticket and arrived early, so he'd have plenty of time to find Megan. I tried to pull her away, but I could tell by the look on her face that she'd already decided to forgive him again. She played hard to get all the way until we got to our standing spot, I guess. But that's when she ditched me. I was insanely furious. I knew she wasn't coming back. Less than 10 minutes after Megan left, a creepy older guy came up to me. I could hear him trying to say something to me over the music, something that sounded like, "Are you alone?" Assuming that's what he said, I said my boyfriend would be back any minute, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he made a joke about keeping his seat warm, so no weirdos could try to hit on me, of course. Obviously, standing, that wasn't necessary, and for other reasons, it wasn't necessary either. I told him so much. And then he launched into a story about the time he met Kurt Cobain backstage, which was complete bullshit. I must have looked as uncomfortable as I felt, because two bikers stopped as they were passing by. The taller one asked if I was okay, but the creepy guy answered before I could get a word out. He tried to call me his girlfriend, but I wasn't having it. I yelled that I'd never seen him before, and backed away as far as the crowd would let me. The bikers scared him off and tried to say that he was just another drunk idiot, but I'm rarely so lucky. As the stadium filled, I watched for him as much as I did for Megan, even though the chances of seeing her were slim to none. I didn't notice him again until halfway through the second or third song. While everyone else was watching the band, I was watching for his loud neon headband. He managed to find a spot in the row behind me, but he looked away the moment our eyes met. However, I still saw the furious expression on his face. I wanted to see how long it took for him to glance back in my direction, and it was even faster than I expected. When he saw I was still looking, he didn't turn away again. This time, he gave the most menacing grin I've ever seen, as he looked from me to the spot next to me and back with a wink. I only took my eyes off of him for a second, but he was gone when I turned back. I jumped at every movement from the corner of my eye as I waited for him to reappear next to me, but one song faded into another without any sight of him. At one point, a different guy came over to offer me a drink, but I was too paranoid to take it, and he was quick to disappear back into the crowd. When the show finally ended, there was still no sign of Megan. I looked for her all over, but the crowd eventually thinned out enough for me to spot the creepy guy again, and he was still watching me. When he realized I saw him, he tried to walk off in the other direction, but I knew he wasn't going to give up so easily after waiting that long. I didn't want the crowd to get too thin, so I fell in behind a big group heading toward the parking lot. Unfortunately, Megan's car was parked at the very back, and I watched in horror as my group dwindled down to just a couple, almost too drunk to stand. Across a few rows of vehicles, there was another large group crowded around someone's fancy car. I decided to try my luck over there. I was about halfway across when I passed a cluster of large trucks, and a hand clamped over my mouth. I couldn't make a sound as I was dragged between the trucks and slammed against the side of a black Ford. It was the same guy, and he looked angrier than ever. He kept one hand over my mouth, and the other had a tight grip on my left arm. I could smell weed and liquor all over him as he ranted about what a pretentious bitch I was, and I thought he was going to kill me. The longer he talked, the tighter his grip became, and there wasn't another soul in sight from between those huge trucks. Finally, he pointed to a red Chevy a few rows ahead and said it was his. He meant to get me inside, and I made a point to tune out everything he said after that. My only concern was preparing to scream as loudly as possible the moment we were within view of other people. Once we were a few steps away from the big trucks, I could see the same crowd from before still gathered around the fancy car. Then, right at the back of the group, I saw Megan, and she was looking right at me. I screamed her name so loud my voice cracked, and I saw the confusion on her face turn to fear as she took in the situation. The grip on my arm became so tight I thought the bone would break, but the stranger decided to cut his losses when he saw Rick and several of his friends running straight towards us. I was crying tears of relief even as I was thrown to the ground. I didn't move as the man took off, and I didn't say a word when Megan helped me up. I just took her keys and stole her car. I knew that she would leave with Rick and pick it up the next day, and that's exactly what happened. So, yeah, I'm not a fan of concerts. I have a basement apartment in a small, quiet town, and I routinely go for walks on sleepless nights. The streets stay busy during the day since I'm only a couple blocks away from the heart of downtown. But at night, there's rarely a soul to be seen. I'm an introvert who works from home, so this is really the only time I even go outside. I always walk the same route. It makes a square that leads right back to the front door. At the halfway point, there's a house that's been empty longer than I've been alive. It's known for being haunted, but I've never believed in that stuff or been inside of it until last night. As I was passing by, I heard a banging sound coming from inside and what sounded like a muffled cry for help. I thought some nosy kid had gotten stuck or something. As I approached the front window to look inside, there was only silence. So I called through the broken glass. "Hello? Is anyone here? You okay?" I couldn't make out what was said, but someone or something in the back of the house answered me. I still couldn't make out most of the words, but at least one was help, or maybe hell, but help seemed more likely given the circumstances. I had to lay my jacket over the broken glass along the windowsill, but I clearly wasn't the first to do so. Kids were always daring each other to go inside, which is why I was so ready to believe that one was in there right now. As soon as I got in, I noticed it was several degrees colder, but I didn't have much time to think about it because there was also an awful smell, the worst stench I've ever experienced. It was like something died and was left to rot in the sun for weeks. The floor creaked beneath my every step as I crossed the living room area and entered the kitchen. Trash was scattered everywhere, and the smell was somehow growing worse the further I went. Realizing I hadn't heard anything since coming inside, I called out again. "Is anyone here?" The only answer I received was a sudden, desperate knocking on the basement door. It was 8 to 10 feet away, and I could see it shaking in its frame with each violent bang. I thought some kid had gotten locked down there and was getting the scare of his life, but then the doorknob turned effortlessly in my hand, and nobody was on the other side. I was, however, hit with a powerful blast of something putrid. It made me throw up a little. I definitely found the source of whatever was causing that horrendous smell. I couldn't see anything past the dark staircase, and I didn't want to. I suddenly felt like something was watching me, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Something had lured me into that house, and now it wanted me to go down the stairs, but I wasn't having it. I turned around and ran, but when I crossed through the living room, something pushed me down. It felt like 2 hands pressed flat on my back and shoved me right to the ground. I was a little dazed and extremely frightened, but there was nothing around me, so I got back up and stumbled outside in a hurry. When I got home, I could still feel the imprint of where something had touched my back, so I looked in the mirror and I found 2 large red marks right in the center. I don't know what's in that abandoned house, but I don't joke about it anymore. The place is absolutely haunted. Let me tell you how to score a couple of free flights to anywhere on the North American continent. All you gotta do is spend 6 hours on a non-stop flight to Montreal in a packed airplane while seated next to a dead man. And wouldn't you know it, he got the window seat. The dead man hadn't boarded the plane like this, however. Allow me to explain. I'm flying home from a bachelor party. I'm the last class on the plane. And when I get to my row of seats, it's in between two older men around the same age as each other. But they don't know each other, so my spot was right there in between them. 8B, 8A, and 8C are filled up, as well as every other number and letter on this plane. So, on a packed flight with no other option, I'm forced to squeeze in. The stewardess has to come over and push me down in my seat. My knees are almost up to my chest as I started to feel hungover from the morning of drinking I did just hours earlier. Don't be all judgy. My best friend was getting married, so I decided I'd surprise him by showing up and getting wasted with all of his groomsmen while he played it safe. Because he was getting married in the morning. His groommen didn't really give a fuck, though. It was cool. I couldn't stay for the wedding because I had to work on Sunday and the rest of the week. Anyway, flying there was fine. I was with all the guys. We had 2 layovers before getting to California. But on the way back, I was by myself. I thought that the 6-hour flight would be an easier trip. I was arriving home at 4. My girlfriend was picking me up before she went to work. The plane takes off, and 10 minutes into the air, the window seat guy starts huffing and gasping, then just slumps forward. His forehead came to rest on the chair in front of him. If I hadn't heard him struggling, I'd have probably thought he was sleeping. Maybe. It looked like a pretty uncomfortable position to be in. I tap the man, asking if he's all right. He doesn't respond. I tap the button above me. When a flight attendant walks over, I express the concerns I had regarding the man's odd behavior. She also attempts to get his attention a few times before she places her hand on his neck, checking for a pulse. She then quickly leans back up and walks down the aisle straight into the cockpit. A few minutes later, she walks out and points to the back. One of the pilots is standing next to her, leaned out of the doorway looking at my section. They then both return back into the cockpit before the stewardess again walks out and closes the door behind her. She walks out of sight and I eagerly wait for her to return. When she does, she's with another woman. She has a stethoscope and checks the man by the window. Then she and the other stewardess drape a white sheet over the man. Then I'm told that the pilots have decided not to make an emergency landing. Because the man was dead, there was technically no longer an emergency. Her face sorta does this funny thing as she delivers the next bit of information. Due to the flight being full, they were unable to move the man, and in turn, also unable to move me and the other man, the alive one. She says that when the plane does land, the man seated next to me and myself will be compensated for our patience with the unfortunate circumstances. Then it was suggested I scroll through their movie selection to pass time. I guess I was sort of in shock. I just started going through the movies. I chose Fast and Furious, Tokyo Drift. The other man opted for sleeping. I don't know how in the hell he was able to sleep with a dead man sitting 2 seats away, but I guess I'd find out soon. Most of the cabin lights were out in the plane when I turned my light off, but out of the corner of my eye, I swear to God the guy under the sheet moved, like leaned up for a second before drooping back down. My heart started racing. I quickly flipped the light back on. Never felt a sensation like that before. My teeth jittered when I saw the white fabric start raising. The light above me leaves a glare on the screen that I'm trying to watch the movie on, but every time I flip the light off, the sheet starts to twitch and move. I closed my eyes and tried not to look in its direction. Then its leg shakes and bumps mine. It's too much. I jump up without even thinking, waking the man next to me. He looks annoyed. He fixes his eye mask and proceeds to sleep. I look around the plane. Those near our seats seem to be aware of what's happening, whereas the front of the plane seems less involved in what's going on. Either way, none of these people are going to switch seats with me. I reluctantly sit back down. I can't even focus on the movie anyway. Only the man. He's not moving for now. I'm too afraid to even close my eyes. I find myself spiraling internally at the situation at hand. I focus on my small cabin light, staring into it instead of anywhere else on the plane. I don't know how much time passed as I stared and thought about this mess, and suddenly the light flickers, ever so slightly. Never seen that before. Just as suddenly, a woman from in front of me turns around and says, "I'm sorry, what was that? What do you need?" She's making eye contact through the small slit between the seats. I didn't say anything, so I told her, "I didn't say anything, sorry." She stands up, turns around, looks from me to the man sleeping, to the man under the sheet. She's starting to resemble what I'm feeling inside, horrified. She asks if I'm sure, which I am, so I tell her as much. She apologized and slowly took her seat. What was that? I had no idea, but it didn't help me with my feelings of anxiety or dread. I looked over at the dead man, still not moving. That's good. I turned toward the sleeping man, and I closed my eyes. Somehow, someway, I fell asleep. I don't think it lasted very long. In either way, I was awoken abruptly by being met with a horrifying odor. It, along with some newfound sounds, are coming from the dead man. Holy fuck, I think to myself. I'm smelling this guy now. It doesn't take long before I notice that others around me are already reacting to this smell, looking around for the source of the offensive odor. Of course, I knew where it was coming from, and it was inescapable. How was it humanly possible to be in this situation? My mind was bending over and over again, and it continued through the entire flight. I didn't sleep another wink, just sat there, paranoid, looking at the dead man every few moments. I still hadn't turned my cabin light off, so I could see. The man had shifted. Surely just naturally. Natural death stuff. That's what I told myself. It must have been another hour into the flight. I heard this moan or groan, but it sounded very alive. The woman in front of me, she heard it too. I see her turn and make eye contact through the seats. Silently yet collectively, we both hit the button for assistance, anxiously waiting to see a stewardess head in our direction. When she arrives, I ask if she can check the man's pulse. I tell her, "We're hearing noises, like he's trying to breathe." Her eyes widen, and she grabs another stewardess, the one with the stethoscope. They reach across me once more, this time removing the sheet. And as morbidly curious as I am, I can't bring myself to look at the man. But the smell, it's enough this time to make me get up. I apologize as I pushed past the group. I'm definitely gonna throw up. I actually managed to make it to the bathroom, but I lose whatever contents I had once I get there. Mainly leftover alcohol. It's horrible, but it doesn't compare to what I've experienced thus far. I, a full-grown man, wanted to cry at the idea of going back to sitting next to a dead man. But the door, it won't open. Why the fuck won't it open? This entire flight is turning into a flight of firsts for me. I start shaking the door, switching the lock back and forth, anything I can. I think to myself, am I seriously gonna have to press the help button? I keep trying the door, and as I'm pushing, doing nothing special, it just opens, almost hitting the flight attendant who had made it to the other side of the door. She looked a little confused, but God, if only she knew how fucking confused I was. She's asking me if I'm okay. I don't even know what to say, so I give her an answer by shaking my head and walking back to my seat. But I turn around to ask the woman, was he alive? But her wince tells me no, and then she confirms it with a verbal no. Great. The last 2 hours of the flight, much like the first 4, were hell. My free vouchers or flying miles didn't seem worth this experience at all. Would I ever even get on another plane? I thought to myself. Approaching our aisle, I wanted to just go live in the bathroom, but I sucked it up and took my seat. The woman in front, she turns around again. Psst. Hey. They said the man doesn't have a pulse, that he's really dead. I wait, expecting her to tell me more. She doesn't, so I share that I'm aware. She scoffs as though we're on the outside of some joke, and she says, but you heard him too, right? Like you heard him talking and the moaning, like, please tell me you heard that too. The thing is, I'd heard some of it. Worst of all, I'd felt several of these post-mortem. But speaking, no, I hadn't heard that. I didn't know what to say. Should I lie and spare this woman's sanity? Do I tell the truth, potentially sending her into some sort of, I don't know, psychosis? My brain truly couldn't handle much more. For all I knew, this lady was nuts. Something told me, though, that she wasn't. I just told her, I've definitely been hearing things over here. This is all just very disturbing. She nods in agreement, exchanges a half-hearted smile before turning back around. What the fuck? Never been so happy to land. I've had turbulence. I've had actual emergency landings before, but this was my first time experiencing death on a flight. And I gotta say, hands down the worst. I imagine the plane literally crashing is the only thing that could surpass this situation. Leaving that airport, I was replaying everything in my head, and again out loud to my girlfriend. And it's like, was the woman crazy? Or is it even remotely possible that somehow she was hearing this man's ghost speaking to her? I don't really mess with that stuff, but apparently my girlfriend thinks it's literally possible. She also thought that being able to fly anywhere was pretty great, despite everything I'd just told her. But truly, I haven't been very eager to fly again. I always thought it would have been fun to be a twin. The chances of me being a twin were rather high, considering the fact that my mom was one. She told me this fact when I was pretty little, along with the fact that she was adopted. But about 10 years ago, I learned a lot more about that story, and it's one that I have to share. It's the story of how my mom learned that she had a twin, all while pregnant with me. Bear with me. I'm telling this story from what my mom told me over 10 years ago on my 21st birthday. My dad had fallen asleep, and Mom wanted to have one more glass of wine and some daughter time. Somehow our conversation shifted to family, and the more she talked that night, the more I was like, yep, she's definitely sharing this story with me. She tried to cut it short at one point, but as you'll see, it's not the kind of story you can just stop telling. So, for the record, my mom's name is Jeanette, my dad is Colin. Jeanette meets Colin in college, 1989. They're both attending BHSU in Spearfish. They fall in love. Jeanette becomes pregnant in the winter of 91. I wasn't planned, but optimistic Jeanette thinks that she can get through spring quarter and graduate. Before my pretty little face can emerge into the world, and destroy her petite figure. She calls her parents living back in Douglas, Wyoming, and they're elated, made a plan for her and Colin to move back in with them when they're out of college. That weekend, Colin would treat Jeanette to a dinner and a night in Rapid City to celebrate the good news. It was about 45 minutes from their apartment in Spearfish, and Jeanette was looking forward to exploring the town. At dinner, their waiter comes to the table and Colin orders a drink. He asks for Colin's ID. When Colin hands it to the man, he glances at it before handing it back. Then he turns to Jeanette. She orders a water, but he still asks for her ID. She says that she's not drinking, and then tells the waiter their good news. He doesn't say congratulations or even smile. He just says something like, "Yeah, still gonna need your ID." So Jeanette reluctantly digs around in her purse to get her ID out for the waiter. When he takes it from Jeanette's hand, he closely examines it to make sure it's not fake. She watches as he looks it over, front and back, then tries to peel any hidden stickers off by rubbing his fingernails down, looking for ridges. He then takes a notepad out from his apron, jots down a few words before handing the ID back to Jeanette. She asks if there's a problem, inquiring about what he wrote on his little notepad. He tells her that he just needed to make sure it wasn't a fake ID. They could lose their license selling to a minor. Then he leaves the table. When the drinks are delivered, it's a new waiter, and she becomes their server for the rest of the night. Colin gets absolutely trashed off of what Jeanette recalls as 2 drinks. Again, Jeanette's not drinking alcohol, so she assumes the bartender's just pouring them heavy. They've partied together many times before, and she's seen him this drunk a handful of times. But Jeanette's still a little surprised at how fast it happened. Not to mention, this wasn't supposed to be a party night. Their meal alone was going to cost over $100. It was supposed to be a nice night. By the end of their dinner date, Colin needs help pulling his wallet out of his pocket, and Jeanette no longer feels excited to spend the night away from their cats in their apartment back in Spearfish. She makes the obvious decision and decides to drive them home. When they get into the car, Jeanette's in the driver's seat of Colin's car, and Colin's dry heaving, lying in the back. She thinks she'll take the long Sturgis road up to the freeway towards home. But a few miles down the highway road, she hears the rumble of what she thinks is a helicopter. But she quickly realizes what it is when her rearview mirror is lit up with tons of bright orbs. She knew the lights couldn't be from cars because they weren't fixed to each other the way headlights would move in the dark. Suddenly, the lights in the rumble weren't so distant in her mirrors. She could see around 10 motorcycles surrounding the car. Jeanette's already a nervous driver when she's behind the wheel, so to see this biker gang on every side of her car makes Jeanette nervous. She slams on her brakes, and the motorcycles behind her almost wipe out trying to avoid her, while a few others stop directly in front of the vehicle, blocking the road. She pleads for Colin to wake up. There's a small moment of silence before any of the bikers approach their car, and my mom hears gurgling. That's when she turns around in her seat and sees my dad choking on his own vomit. She grabs him and has just enough strength to pull him onto his side. When she does, the rest of what he was throwing up falls onto the floor of the back seat. Colin inhaled. Then, the window above him was smashed in. Jeanette's window was next. The roar of men shouting and more glass breaking slowly came back into focus, and Jeanette turned back around, just as one of the bikers had his arm reaching through the broken driver's side window, unlocking her door. Then it opens, and she's grabbed and pulled from the car. Jeanette's terrified, screaming and completely confused as to what's happening. A biker grabs her by her hair and throws her to the ground, calling her a dumb cunt. Jeanette's screaming, "What do you want? Please, don't kill us." The biker that threw her on the ground now stands over her with a hunting knife. He tells her to take off her top, and she begs him not to. But the man interrupts her by grabbing the fabric of her shirt and cutting it off of her body. Jeanette sobbed as she was flipped onto her stomach. She was sure the worst was about to happen. The gravel hurt her skin, and the motorcycle lights shining in her face made it hard to see how many people were there. Face down, Jeanette hears an audible hush shared amongst the bikers. The man above her tells one of the men to go get the purse. She hears the car door open and shut. They dump her purse onto the ground, and all of its contents fall around Jeanette's head. The biker picks up her ID off the ground. A moment later, he picks Jeanette up off the ground. She stands quietly, covering herself the best she can, as he looks at the ID. When he looks at her again, he asks if she's ever met a woman named Gilda, and tells her, don't fucking lie to him. Genuinely confused and relieved to not know a single Gilda, she tells the man, I don't know who that is. Bullshit. She hears from somewhere behind the man with her ID. The man comes into view, and Jeanette realizes it's the waiter from the restaurant, the one who also examined her ID and had taken their drink orders. The man with the ID tells the other guy to shut up, and then asks Jeanette if she's got family around here. Are her parents Donna and Alec? She immediately tells the man no, that her adoptive family is from Wyoming, to which one of the men asks, what the fuck are you doing in Rapid City then? Jeanette says she's currently a student at BHSU. She bends down scrambling for her student ID, presenting it to the man, hoping this will prove her case. He grabs the ID and examines it, as he did the first one. Time is crawling, but the man is silent, passing the ID to the man behind him. Then, after several moments, he says, you have a sister. But not in the form of a question. It's a statement. Jeanette stares at the man, confused, but before she can respond, he says, a twin. You have a twin sister. And your sister? She's not welcome here. In fact, she should be dead. She tells the man that she doesn't know anything about a sister or a twin. She tells him again she's from Wyoming. This is her first time in Rapid City. She's crying, she's confused, and just plain scared. The man hands her the student ID, while the other guy walks back to his bike. The man with the knife tells her, you'd better make this your last trip to Rapid City. Your sister, your twin, she's not welcome here. And if we see you again, we'll have to assume you're her, and we won't be able to let you go. Do you understand what I'm saying? My mom nods her head, showing the man she understands what he's saying. Oh, and sorry about your guy. Couldn't have him trying to be a hero. He'll be fine in about 12 hours. Don't even think about going to the cops. Waste of your time and ours. Understand? She nods once more. And then the man holds up his left arm, making some sort of turn it around motion, and all of the bikes fire up at the same time, while the man turns and walks back to his own bike. Within seconds, the loud rumbling passes by Jeanette once again as she stands in the middle of the street. Eventually, it's silent, and she's processing everything that just happened, but quickly makes her way back to the car. She's relieved that Colin hasn't moved back onto his back, but remembers the man's words. He'll be fine in about 12 hours. To this day, my mom had no idea what they gave my dad, but whatever it was kept him out for hours. Once back at the apartment, my mom struggles to get my dad out of the car. Realizing she literally can't do it, she lays him back on his side, closes the door, and runs into their apartment to call her parents. So this was the night that my mom learned of Gilda and the full truth about her adoption. Grandma explains that yes, Jeanette had a twin. The girl's mother had decided to put them both up for adoption, but not together. For whatever reason, the twins were split up and adopted out to 2 different families. It wasn't an open adoption either, so all my grandparents knew was that the other girl was adopted by a family in Rapid City. They didn't know the name of the family, and they never knew what they decided to name the girl. Confused, upset, scared, These are all things my mom explained feeling after the phone call and experience. My grandparents wanted Jeanette and Colin to drive to their house as soon as possible, but Mom was too tired to make that almost 5-hour drive. So that night, my parents slept in their car. My mom explained everything to my dad the next morning. Naturally, he wanted to go to the police, but it was my mom that assured him that wasn't an option, that their only option was to forget about the whole thing and to never end up in Rapid City again. That's what they did. I asked my mom if she ever looked for her sister, but she told me no, that she was far too afraid to go digging after that whole experience, and even more afraid once I entered the world. I can't say that I blame her. It seemed obvious that her sister was entangled with a scary group of people that my mom never wanted to see again. I asked if she was mad at my grandparents for keeping this from her, and she also said no. She said that she thinks that they did the right thing, especially seeing how everything turned out. It was better this way, she told me. In case you're curious, I never went looking either, but I did finally understand why our family never made our way to Rapid City. As Grandma always says, it's not wise to go where you're not welcome.
When I was in middle school, my last class would be PE. I'd walk home after the bell rang, so I'd usually just stay in my sweaty PE clothes, then take a shower when I got home. We lived relatively close to my middle school, so the walk there and back in either direction was only about 2 miles. Along my route, I passed by a little gas station. I'd often stop in and grab a drink on my way home. I think it was a Tuesday afternoon when I entered the gas station. A woman named Zoe sat behind the register reading a magazine. I had my headphones on while listening to Linkin Park on my Walkman CD player. She glanced up and we exchanged smiles before I turned to start perusing up and down the beverage section. It's one of the farthest areas from the register. After making a selection of Mountain Dew, I grabbed the plastic bottle from the refrigerated glass encasing, then turned to the register. There's now someone there talking to Zoe, so I stand a few feet back and wait for him to purchase his stuff. The music is loud in my headphones. My attention jumps from cardboard cutouts and glittery cigarette advertisements until, out of the corner of my eye, there's a flurry of movement. Back at the register, I see Zoe halfway across the counter, wrestling with the man for something in his hands. Then, over the music playing in my ears, I hear a loud pop, pop. The ceiling and the wall behind the counter becomes dusted, and Zoe collapses on the counter motionless in a growing pool of blood on the countertop. The man screams, "Fuck!" Then turns around and sees me standing frozen a few feet behind him. But a new scream makes us both jump as a worker named Tim opened the employee room door coming back from a break. The man runs away while Tim continues to scream while running to the counter. He runs behind the counter and pulls Zoe off of the counter. When she slid off onto the ground, he could see the full extent of damage and knew that she had died. Tim called the cops and begs me to stay, but I'm in shock and I just nod my head and go sit down behind another aisle away from the front door, shocked and terrified that he was coming back. When the police showed up, they took my name outside and collected a statement from me, but it wasn't needed. While we were outside, another patrol car pulls up with someone in the back seat. The window unrolled and an officer asks, "Is this the guy?" I lean over and look at the barred window frame. And they'd caught him all right, and it looks like they did a number on him too. I said yes without a second thought, and he spits on me through the bars. Blood and saliva splatter on my chin and PE shirt. The man protests to the officer in the back seat, and he shouts, "This kid's lying." After denying his crime, he turns back towards me. I take another step backwards to brace for another disgusting spit stream to come my way, but what he accosted me with was promises of us meeting again at a later date. He said that when he finds me, he's not only going to kill me, he's also going to kill my pets and my family. The reflective rear passenger window began to roll up again, but not before he yelled out one more thing to me. He called me by my last name. Then he repeated it again and again, like he was memorizing it until the window fully sealed and he was out of sight. The patrol car leaves and the cop asks if I need a ride home, but I declined. I was overstimulated and needed air. Walking home, I couldn't figure out how he knew my name. It's a German last name that's difficult to pronounce if you're not familiar with German dialect. Then I looked down at the splotches of mucus and blood he'd left on my shirt and my heart dropped. I realized my last name, the school I go to, and the city it's located in was all plastered on my chest like a billboard. It was 1991, and I was 12. It is now February 2023, and I'm almost 45. Although I live in the same county as my childhood, my zip code's 3 towns over and in a more rural area. Recently, a lot of odd things have been occurring, like a lot all at one time. November, one of our neighborhood dogs had puppies. They called my wife and we took my son over to pick one out. We ended up getting 3. We have a big fence and property where the dogs can play outside without escaping. Cars rarely drive down our residential street, but we're still close enough to the road that a tall chain-link fence could keep everyone safe, kid included. January. Dogs have grown a substantial amount, and it's like watching a Disney movie to see them all play so gently with my son outside. One evening, I came home to discover all 3 of them dead in the front yard. The next morning, I'd walk every part of the yard looking for clues as to how 3 healthy dogs could die within a workday from seeing them. Near the corner of the yard, behind our cherry tree, I found pieces of raw ground meat stuck in parts of the fence, leading me to suspect that someone might have poisoned them by pushing the tainted meat through the fence for them to eat. I was devastated for my son. I didn't tell him about the poisoning part, but he's 5 and didn't ask questions after I broke the news to him. Either late April or early May on this year, my wife was driving home from picking the kids up from daycare. She told me a guy followed her from the parking lot all the way to our neighborhood before my wife was freaked out enough to drive to the closest spot, which was the Le Schwab Tire Center. When an employee jogged out, she told him what was going on, and they were both able to watch the white Mazda that had been following her just drive by. When she felt comfortable to go, my wife took the back roads home and didn't see the Mazda again. Both of our phones have been called multiple times by different numbers, all from a prepaid track phone. All you have to do to activate one of those is purchase a card with some minutes on it. The first time my wife answered her phone, the caller asked if this was Arnold's number. And that's my name. My wife thinks it's a work friend, so she says no. And then she says that it's her name and says Arnold's my name. She and I are in the same plan, and our phone numbers are identical besides the last digit. It's an easy mistake, but my wife also stated that she only got as far as telling him, "No, Arnold's my husband," before they disconnected. I answered the next call that would come on my phone, but the other line was silent after I said hello. We have a home security system with a couple cameras to monitor the property. A while back, I thought to spend a day fast-forwarding through the footage and to see if anything weird has been happening around the house. We haven't had any notifications from our Ring doorbell, but it's the only camera that can see out to a little bit of the road. The best way that I can think to go through the footage was to start at the most recent files, then work my way backwards. On the program I used to open the video files, it shows you little still frames of the video at the bottom as a quick view. Most of the frames are identical to one another. 3 days before that, the thumbnails at the bottom show a white car passing by our house while everyone was gone. The camera isn't good enough to capture what kind of car it was, but it clearly was a white car. I continue to open the files to see that this same white car with black tinted windows has come driving past our house once or twice a week since March. All of these weird events got me thinking about the worst case scenario, and it felt like a punch to the gut when I remembered the guy's promise. I don't know if I'm just being paranoid, but it's been almost 30 years since what happened at the gas station. His name was Paul Smith. What I was told back then was that he had warrants in other states too, and he would be going to jail in whatever state that jury finds him guilty in. I'm terrified he was released and he's come back for me. Please, tell me if I'm being paranoid. Please, any lawyers, what can I do in this situation? Do I really have to wait for something to happen in order to report anything?
I work at a private impound lot in a big city. When I started this job, I was nervous about my safety. I'd never done any security work, and I have 3 kids to support, along with a diabetic wife, but I was assured that there was nothing to worry about. Apparently, just having someone present is enough to keep most people away. It's a small lot, and we don't deal with vehicles used in crimes or anything like that. Most of our business comes from wrecks or people parking where they shouldn't. And those are usually the kind of people who pick them up on that same day, disgruntled and annoyed, but not dangerous. On the extremely rare occasion that someone tried to sneak in during the night, it was usually to retrieve something left in the car. That's only happened to me once so far, and I let the guy grab his stuff just because he was civil about it. Overall, I get pretty comfortable pretty fast. It's an easy job with benefits and a lot of downtime. This last week, we got this wrecked truck. It wasn't totaled, mostly just cosmetic damage from where it had ran into a guardrail. The driver had a stroke, and luckily no one else was involved. But he wasn't so lucky. He wasn't going too fast, so by the time he hit the rail, his speed was down. Unfortunately, that's where his luck stopped. His only family members live in another state, so that means the truck was ours until they made arrangements. It was a red 2-door Dodge Ram 1500 with untinted windows, and it sat in the slot closest to my booth about 30 feet away, so I had a great view of it. Normally, I just pass the time by reading or scrolling through my phone. I don't actually have to leave my booth unless it's to deal with a trespasser. Well, the first night we had that damn truck, I was reading some random article when I saw something move from the corner of my eye. When I looked up, it was just in time to see a head duck down inside the Dodge, like someone had gotten inside, saw me looking, and dropped out of sight. My blood was instantly pumping. My heart could have beat right through my ribcage with the way that it took off. I know some people are all about that adrenaline rush, but it's just not my drug of choice. I stared through the truck's back windshield for a solid 10 minutes before finally making my move. I figured I could just wait for whoever it was to come out, but if he managed to get inside and shut the door without me noticing, then I couldn't risk taking my eyes away for a second. Next, I tried to call out from the booth. I promised the guy I wouldn't call the cops as long as he left without any trouble, but there was no response. Finally, I had no choice but to go over there. I only had a taser as I crept toward the truck, but I didn't need it. The vehicle was empty. I knew I had seen someone, but I could only watch the live security feeds. I don't have access to the system controls. There was nothing I could do except assume I was hallucinating, so I went back to my booth. After a little time passed, it became easier to believe that I'd just imagined the shape of a person in the shadows. But almost 2 hours later, the horn suddenly went off by itself. It was a good 3-second blast that nearly knocked me out of my skin. It wasn't the alarm, just the horn. And once again, there was no one around. Half an hour later, I was back to reading and still wary. I kept looking at the Dodge every few minutes, and I eventually saw the shadow person once more, but it didn't duck down like it had the first time. It seemed to be looking straight ahead, out the front windshield, with its hands on the wheel. Also, its head was shaped a little funny, like it was wearing a hat. I stared at it for almost a minute, just to be absolutely certain I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Then I dashed out of the booth one last time. In the split second my eyes were off the figure, was all it took for it to disappear. My shift ended less than a half an hour later. Nothing more happened. That was on a Friday. The truck was picked up on a Sunday. I'm completely fine never seeing it again. but I feel like that had to be the old man's ghost, right? I never experienced anything like that firsthand until then. Later, I found the man's picture in the obituaries, and he was wearing one of those funny-shaped fedora hats, just like what I saw on the shadow. The security company I worked for had a contract with a construction company as they renovated the cafeteria of a high school. We set up a little shack on the property, then connected a bunch of cameras in strategic positions all around the building that would feed back to the shack. Then, every hour, I'd walk the premises with my flashlight. It was a pretty good gig. The high school was out in the suburbs and in a nice neighborhood. I think it was a private school. There was a lot of money sunk into the architecture of this building, and there was a family of deer that would eat bread if I threw it to them. I bought 1,000,000 loaves at the gas station and probably overfed those deer while I was there, but you gotta entertain yourself somehow. Because it was such a nice neighborhood, my boss only assigned 1 guard per shift, and usually this was great. I'd use the time to read or play my Game Boy, but the last week I was there, an incident happened that really freaked me out. I'd been out walking, making my rounds. It's a hot summer night, and I'm waiting for my dear friends to arrive. I stood there with my loaf of bread in hand, tossing slices like a frisbee into the field, when one of the alarms starts ringing. I didn't have to check the security cameras to see where the disturbance had come from, because when I turned to start going towards the shack, I saw that one of the library windows had been opened all the way. The windows on this library are big, and they move like a garage door. I shine my flashlight towards the window and catch someone halfway hiding behind the curtains. Their legs up to their shins were completely visible. They were wearing black pants and were barefoot. When the light hits the long white curtains that partially concealed him, he took off running into the dark library. My adrenaline spikes and my hands start shaking. This is my first real pursuit. I trained in kickboxing and could run marathons back in those days. I wasn't afraid that I couldn't catch him. I was afraid that he'd have a weapon on him when I did. All I could do was chase after him, screaming at him to stop and that I'm permitted to use the gun that I've been issued to deal with trespassers. I was bluffing on the gun part, where permitted pepper spray, handcuffs, and a baton. I'm forced to abandon the loaf of bread and grab the extendable metal beating stick from my belt while holding my flashlight with the other. Then, I run through the curtains into the library. Exit signs are the only source of light besides what I have. There's too many places to hide in a library. I listened for running feet, but the library was silent. He couldn't have run so far out of ear's range that fast. The walls and floors just beyond the library are made of large granite stone and bricks. I should have been able to hear what direction he was running with how he bolted. Thinking that he's most likely hiding behind one of the many bookshelves, I cautiously work my way up to the front of the library and flick on the lights. But the electricity is turned off due to construction. I pan my flashlight across the library, left and right, and I see him again. This time he's standing behind a shelf that reaches chest level. He ducks down and knocks a few books onto the ground. He's too fast for me to get a description of what he looked like besides an eerie, pale white face, with what I thought was a black sleep mask covering his eyes. When I get to the row of shelves, he's no longer behind them. He's crawled a few rows down. My flashlight spots his legs crawling behind them, and I rush after. But somehow in the brief moment, my light isn't on him. When I go around the books, he's gone. My arm hair stands on end, and it's hard to control my breathing. It feels like I'm going to hyperventilate. Then the gears holding the window in place start to click faster and faster, and the whole thing comes crashing down with a boom that shakes the floor. The glass shatters into pieces on the floor. Instantly after the crash, I heard bare feet running through the commons behind me. As the footsteps echoed away, I ran the opposite direction, back through the window and straight to the shack. None of our cameras were inside the school, so I switched back and forth between the perimeter cams, looking for the guy, but nothing turned up. I spent the next hour dreading having to go out again. The alarm is still ringing in the distance, and I start to think it's not hooked up to anything because nobody's shown up to inspect it. None of my bosses are answering their phones. The best thing I can think to do is go take pictures of the broken window. When I return to the library, the bent metal window frame is once again in a locked position, wide open. Seeing this breaks my last nerve of courage, and I run back to the shack and lock myself in until I'm relieved of my position. When my coworker arrives around 2:50, I see his car headlights pull into the property. I have the door open and ready for him to come in. The company belt's sitting on the desk, waiting to be strapped on by the next protector of this construction site. When I walk outside, the alarm is no longer ringing, and I leave without telling him about the library. All day I'm expecting to get a call where I have to explain what happened to their big expensive window. But the day goes by and nobody calls. Another goes by and no phone calls. I'm supposed to return for another shift the next night. I'm obviously anxious getting there, terrified by any sound I'd hear outside the shack. I skipped my first couple of scheduled walks, but willed myself to get out there at least once. My legs were hurting from sitting and I needed to stretch anyway. I gather my things and remember to take the camera. Maybe it hasn't been seen yet. I didn't know how thorough the other security guards are on their walks, though I couldn't believe anyone would have missed it. I walk through the grass instead of the concrete walkway in hopes to mute my footsteps from I don't know who. I'm disappointed when I don't see the deer in the field, but I notice the loaf of bread I dropped is gone. Around the corner, I lift the camera up to my eye. The garage-style windows closed this time. Then I put the camera down again. The window in front of me was now fixed. My astonishment led me to walk up to the glass and knock on it. It wasn't my imagination. What I was looking at was real. A window of its size and specifics. It couldn't have been ordered and replaced in 2 days. What could this mean? I really don't know. My grandmother had dementia. Could it be possible I had an episode at 40? I wasn't contacted about it either, and a discovery like that would have definitely warranted some sort of check-in. I got on the computer and pulled up the alarms program. It keeps an automatic record of its activations. But it didn't have any inputs from that night. I got real close to the glass, peered in with my flashlight. The library was exactly how I remembered it being. The scene played out in my head like a movie. I could almost watch it playing out in front of me. All the way up until my flashlight moves over to where the man had ducked behind the shelves, and I saw that the books were lying on the floor from where they'd fallen previously. A foreboding energy filled my body, and I stepped away from the window. The rest of the night and that week, I didn't go to that side of the school. I'd make a C shape around that property, pretending that that corner didn't exist until we were done. I'm a single mother, and I do my best to provide my child with memories he'll be able to look back on when he's my age. I didn't have that many with my mom, and it's important for me to give him what I needed at that age. Without a father, it's been my job to show him how to be strong in this world. I was watching a TED Talk, and the speaker said that fear is primarily a learned trait. Toddlers would watch their parents interact with the environment to understand it for themselves. If they see a situation and think, "Uh-oh, mommy flinched," they will start to perceive the situation as dangerous. If you're afraid of spiders, it's probably because you saw a parent react poorly to them in your adolescence. That's why I've done my best not to flinch when we're together. He's turning 10 in October, and we frequently spend our weekends going to trampoline parks, regular parks, or the movies. But yesterday he saw a YouTube video about those bioluminescent shrimp. We live a little over an hour from the Indian River Lagoon, near Titusville, and I decided, why not? Let's go on a spontaneous little trip. We hopped in the car around 8 to get there as the sun was setting. I'm brave, but not dumb. I always pack pepper spray in my purse, just in case someone were to test my mama bear fury. We pull into the lagoon, and we're one of the only cars in the parking lot. Aiden and I walk down the trail and reach the shoreline. A smile grew on his face as we got closer to the shoreline. This was the first time I'd ever seen these shrimp in real life. He and I stood at the top of the hill, mesmerized at the light show that we were seeing in the water. We walked down the hill until we found a bench to sit on, just before the concrete path touched the sand. There was a man standing in the rocks of the shallow water, quietly fishing. Every time he'd cast his line out, it would stir up the shrimp in the water like blue fireworks in the ripples. Soon, Aiden's oohs and ahs turn into snores as he falls asleep sitting on the bench rested against me. I sat there and realized I was experiencing a rare moment of bliss and silence to myself. Moms know how cherished and fleeting these can be. I took a deep breath, smelling the salty sea air. Falling asleep next to Aiden on the bench would have been easy if I'd let myself fully relax. I noticed the fisherman had started packing his gear. When he turns around, he sees us on the bench. He must not have known we were there previously, and I think our presence startled him. Naturally, he was most likely on his guard too, and didn't know we weren't there posing a threat to him. I try to make it obvious the direction I'm looking, but keep him in the corner of my eye. The fisherman slowly grabs his bucket and tackle box, then starts walking towards us. An unnecessary angle to take if he were heading toward the parking lot. With this trajectory, I begin to wake Aiden up and get him ready to go. I also had to get my purse out from under him without yanking it in a panic. I turn and stare at the approaching fisherman to let him know I'm aware of him. He keeps looking at us, then back down as he tries to find his footing in the slippery rocks. He gets close enough for me to see that he's barefoot, wearing torn jean shorts and a tank top. He has a bushy beard and is incredibly thin. We make eye contact at an increasingly uncomfortable distance as I can see the white of his eyes. He takes another step towards us and then lets out the most horrific, stomach-turning howl I've ever heard from a human's vocal cords. It sounded like those stock screaming sound effects I'd play with in film class, like a war movie death scream. Aiden jolts awake. He's now observant of the dark figure. I flinch. This man starts swinging his arms and throwing his gear around the rocks while continuing to scream bloody murder. I grab Aiden's wrist tightly in my hand and I'm about to start running toward the parking lot, but I see the fisherman collapse onto the rocks. Suddenly, I realized I may have misread the situation. Even from this further distance, the man's growling and groaning continues, but he didn't appear to be moving, not much. So instead of grabbing my keys, I grabbed my cell phone. I called 911 to report the collapsed man in the water. I shuffle through my purse for the keys, unlock the car before handing them over to Aiden, telling him to wait in the car and to lock the doors. With dispatch on the line, I approach the man who's in bad shape, but definitely alive. I relay the information and then ask the man the questions the dispatch is asking me. Sir, can you breathe? Is it your heart? But he's just pointing towards his foot, rapidly. So I turn on the flashlight on my phone to see what I can see. I remembered the man was barefoot as I shined the light. And almost immediately, it was obvious which foot was causing the man such distress. The outside of the man's right foot was immensely swollen and red, but it wasn't just his foot. His right leg up to his knee had started to take the same discoloration. Through labored breaths, the man says it stung him. I relay the information and wait with the man and dispatch for ambulances to arrive. Once they do, I check on Aiden, who's waiting eagerly at the back window. I open the door, telling him I just need a couple more moments with the police. He tries to ask me quickly before shutting the door, what happened to the man? I told Aiden that the man had been stung. But stung by what? I didn't know. Aiden starts talking about the kinds of things that can sting in the water, and before he can get too far through his list, I tell him, just one moment, remember, I need to talk to the police. The officers are actually making their way to my car, so I didn't have to travel far to get the rest of the details. Most importantly, I learned the guy was going to be okay. He was lucky to have someone around, though. Apparently, he'd been stung by a stonefish. Wasn't sure exactly what that was, but I learned they were nasty, not-so-little guys. Aiden told me all about them on the way home, and then we watched a video about them. Truly horrifying. The pain that man must have been in. I can't believe I thought he was coming after us. I'm just so grateful I didn't leave in a panic. My friends and I were trying to make ghost hunting shows long before the paranormal reality TV hype. It was me, my friend Mike, Garrett, and his wife Lacey. Lacey was the manager of a Radio Shack, and she was able to get us all the equipment that we needed for cheap. Her and Garrett would do all of the filming. Mike had the idea and was the face of the show, and I had the van. We did most of our shooting down near Rayleigh. For one of the episodes, we filmed at a supposedly haunted house. Its history had a whole family murder-suicide thing attached to it. It felt like the real deal. The other episodes we filmed previously were at our local graveyards, real lowball content. When everyone loaded into the van that night, Garrett and Lacey were bickering. I'd never seen them fight before this, and Mike and I sat uncomfortably the whole trip as they fought in the back. When we arrived at the house, their arguing died down as we were all a little awestruck at the sight of this dilapidated 2-story wooden structure, once resembling a home. The excitement grew amongst us again, and we were all reinvigorated to spend the night looking for ghosts. It was heightened even more when we walked in, and Garrett got a spike on his EMF detector. The house smelled like mold and dust, and all the furniture in the house looked like it had been thrown around, almost like the couches, tables, and chairs were balanced upside down or laid on their side up against the wall, intentionally. Oddly, there was no graffiti on the walls, and none of the mirrors or glass picture frames had been broken. Some tables still had stuff on them. The house wasn't messy, but every room had the same thing going on with the furniture. Mattresses resting against the wall, upside-down vanities with crystal-clear mirrors still attached and intact. There were technically 4 floors in this house that we'd been exploring. The first floor was the more open area. It held the family room, kitchen, a bathroom, 2 bedrooms. There was a balcony on the second floor that could look down to the first from the stairs connecting them. That floor was more of a long hallway with more bedrooms and another bathroom. The attic, where the supposed suicide of the mother had taken place, after she'd killed her family. A tall, dark, empty, triangular room with wooden support beams that stretched from end to end. I would also find a hollow spot located in the kitchen floor by accident. We all have smaller, cheaper camcorders of our own for when we'd split up and search through the house by ourselves. Fumbling around with my camera in the dark, I drop my lens cover and it bounces to the ground next to me. The room is quiet enough for me to hear it bounce and pinpoint the approximate location that it would be. When the plastic cap hits the ground, it made a sharp metallic tink noise. Instead of a dulled tap the cheap linoleum should have sounded like. I stepped a few feet over, and the pressure of the ground beneath my feet feels different, slightly more springy. I call Lacey over and she shines a light so that I can find my cap. While I'm on my hands and knees, I also felt around for the suspicious piece of metal flooring. I used my fist and pounded around on the ground in front of me until I found the spot again. Lacey saw the handle that would pull up a large section of flooring, revealing stairs into what looked like a homemade bomb shelter. Cans of fruit and vegetables, Boxes of other preserves and non-perishables filled the shelves on the walls. An L-shaped couch next to a small, foldable table both sat upright against the back wall. Discovering that room brought on an indescribably ominous feeling, like we'd released something back into the house when we opened the hatch. When we show Mike and Garrett what we've found, Mike gets extra excited and calls dibs on doing his solo escapade in the basement first. Garrett then calls the first floor. Lacey takes the second floor, and I was the lucky one chosen to spend time in the attic. We got to work on setting up a few extra static cameras around the house before rejoining in a circle on the ground in the living room. To start the night, Mike has his electronic spirit box in his lap, starts asking questions like, "Is anyone with us? Will you give us a sign if you're here?" We hear a few creaks and bumps, but nothing that couldn't be explained away by a house settling in. We decided to save tape and all go to our designated areas. Garrett synced our watches, so right when the timer beeped, we'd all simultaneously hit our record buttons, capturing each room in real time with each other. Climbing up the stairs, my leg breaks through a rotted floorboard, and my jeans get a large rip from the calf up to the knee. I'm lucky as my skin barely grazes the nail that snags my jeans. Lacey, walking up behind me, has to skip that stair while stepping around me before she can help pull me forward. The other stairs are equally as rickety, but none of the other wooden planks would give out on me for the rest of the climb. In the attic, the musty smell hits my nose the moment I pop my head in. There's a window on one side of the vertical walls. Under it is a chair facing out. It's the only item in the attic. My leg begins to throb when the adrenaline wears off, and I can feel the bruising and swelling pain that's growing in my ankle from the fall. The convenience of a sturdy chair to rest it on is too enticing to pass by, and I hobble over to plop my aching body down. As I do, my watch softly beeps once and then begins a 5-second timer. I steady my camcorder and press record on the last beep. The display screen on the side of the camera illuminates, and the footage that I'm getting is way too dark and grainy. I realize what small amount of light I could see being let in from the window wasn't able to be captured on my recording device. I tried messing with the settings, adjusting the contrast and brightness, but nothing could fix this image. That's when I stood up, moved the chair closer to the center of the attic, and turned my camera toward the window itself. The display screen shows a perfect shot. It was so dark in the actual attic that the small amount of light from the night sky looked vibrant and bright coming in. I can hear Lacey below me, pacing up and down the second floor hallway. Her footsteps get quiet as she walks further away from my position. Then, footsteps run back down the hallway towards me. I think that she's coming to the stairs of the attic door, but she never came in. Instead, I heard the footsteps run back down the stairs, away from me again. I sit there listening for the sound of Lacey's footsteps to start up again, questioning if I'd just had a paranormal experience or if Lacey was really running around and why. A loud crash cuts through the silence, sounding like some sort of glass was involved. I nearly jumped to the rafters. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I wondered who accidentally broke something. Positive the noise was loud enough for everyone to pick it up, I went to leave the attic to figure out where it came from. But when I try to open the door, it's locked from the outside. I begin to feel an asthma attack taking hold. Until that moment, I hadn't had an asthmatic flare-up since I was a child. I didn't carry an inhaler with me. As I struggled to get air, I thought 2 decades of not needing to fill that prescription, and my lungs chose this moment to prove they still need steroids to function properly. The sips of oxygen become less and less with each gasp I suck in. Then Lacey started to scream, "Fire! Fire!" I hear her sprinting to where I am, but I'm too weak to call for help. All I can do is collapse backwards, away from the swing of the door. If she did manage to unlock it, I didn't want to be barricaded in there with my corpse. She bounds up the stairs, and I can hear her fighting with the handle until the doors open. I slumped on the support beam desperately, trying to regain control of my breathing while staying conscious. It's like blurry chunks of time after Lacey came in screaming that the house was on fire. When she saw me, her jaw dropped. I remember her helping me down the attic stairs. Smoke was filling the ceiling of the second floor. The fire was coming from the side bedroom. I don't remember the second flight of stairs, or how she helped me avoid the missing step. But I got to the first floor. On our way to the front door, I get a brief sight of Garrett, lying underneath a large, heavy, brass-framed mirror. I don't remember getting through the front door. In the damp grass outside, I woke up to see Lacey standing over me. She was doing CPR on me. My ribs felt broken, but I was breathing on my own. Mike runs out of the house and meets Lacey and I on the lawn. He asks where Garrett is. I don't know if what I saw was a delusion or not, but Lacey confirmed it when she told Mike that he was still in there. She says she saw the mirror leap from its hanging studs on the wall and fall off the balcony onto Garrett. Then smoke started pouring from the bedroom behind her. Mike didn't see Garrett when he heard Lacey's alarm, and he exited the basement. So he runs back in. Lacey tries to stop him, but Mike shakes her off and runs back inside. Mike is quite a bit smaller than Garrett, and he had to dig for every inch, pulling his body out of the house, filling with smoke. My vision gets cloudy. When my focus straightens out again, Garrett has magically appeared next to me in the grass. Garrett's on his back, lying next to me. He's out cold. There's still pieces of glass stuck in his hair, embedded in the fabric of his clothing. Mike frantically scrambles to look for a garden hose around the circumference of the house. He finds one, only to quickly realize the water and plumbing has been shut off years ago, no matter how many times Mike spun the faucet handle. I watch him finally give up and jog back to the three of us still in the grass. Garrett needed to go to the hospital. There was nothing we could do to save the house. I could get air back into my lungs again and told Mike to get Garrett into the van. I get into the driver's seat and Lacey helps slide Garrett's body into the back of the van. She gets in the back with him, and Mike hops in the passenger seat up front with me. It's close to an hour before we get to the hospital. Mike, Lacey, and we sit in the waiting room of the ER. A doctor eventually comes out to talk to Lacey, and I get to hear her recount what happened, filling in the blank pieces of my timeline. She wrestles with words, trying to describe her accounts. A mirror with a heavy brass frame, weighed easily over 50 pounds, floated off the wall and just so happened to land on top of your husband, the doctor asked. Lacey then described the fire that started, and the doctor stops her again and leaves to get the police officer to hear the story and get the fire department out to the house. Lacey repeats the story over again to the cop, and he just stares at her, and then us, then back at her, wide-eyed. He gets on the radio and asks a couple of units to go check on the address we gave him. Then he asks Lacey to tell him again how the mirror floated off the wall. Mike steps in and tries to explain our ghost hunting show, but that doesn't change the cop's expression. The doctor says something clever like, well, your friend Garrett almost became a ghost tonight. Garrett would spend 9 days in the hospital. I would swing by after work every day to check on him, talk to the doctors. By day 3, he's awake again. His jaw had to be wired shut. His face was swollen and a neck brace held his head up. The back of his head had chunks shaved out of it, replaced with rows of staples and stitches. The x-rays on the board above his bed showed that he'd fractured his skull in 3 places. When the mirror hit Garrett, it essentially power-bombed his face directly into the floor, the brass frame landing on the back of his head, crushing it against the ground. When he looked up at me, I could see that his eye sockets were purple and swollen. Besides gestures, for Garrett to communicate, the nurse had to give him a notepad and a pencil. Later in the visit, I asked if he saw the mirror levitate before it hit him. Garrett slowly grabs the notepad and writes on the top piece of paper, then rips it off and shows it to me. The note says, "Can you keep a secret?" I stared at the note, wondering what in the hell kind of secret he would be sharing. I tell him yes, and he quickly rips up the piece of paper, Then he throws the scraps away in the waste bin next to his bed. Garrett picks up the pencil and starts to write again. This time he's writing a while, filling up the page and flipping it over before continuing what he was writing down on the next. Finally, Garrett hands me 6 pages with his tiny handwriting covering each available line the paper provided. I sat back in the chair next to his bed and carefully read his notes. Garrett says he did see the brass mirror, but it didn't float off the wall by a malicious spirit. It was thrown at him by Lacey. On the next page, Garrett tells me that Lacey found some emails with a coworker, with some unforgiving photos attached. He confesses to a brief affair and begs Lacey's forgiveness. Garrett believes that she was just mad at him and understands why. Then he begs me not to tell the cops. The last few pages, he says that he's still trying to make things work with her. Garrett and Lacey were the kind of couple who were okay sharing their business with everyone. I already knew that Lacey had a crazy side, but this was on a level clear past the moon. Garrett was also a little mentally unwell if he was really going to accept attempted murder as a rational response to anything. The house was a total loss by the time the fire department got there. When the cops got around to asking what I knew, I stuck to my original story because technically I wasn't lying about what I'd personally seen that night. Lacey took all of the tapes from the cameras that night. After finding out what really occurred, it was too late to retrieve any video from the night. I don't think Garrett ever told Mike the real story either. Now, get this. Over 20 years later, Mike has a kid and pays child support to a woman he divorced the same year they were married. I too have been married and divorced. My marriage lasted 6 years and thankfully didn't result in any offspring. But Garrett and Lacey are still going strong. It was literally their anniversary at the beginning of this month. Last weekend, we all went bowling. I still regularly hang out with these people. All I can say is that love is strange, but their relationship is none of my business. If they're happy, I'm happy. Oh yeah, years later, I'd be told that Lacey started the fire in the bedroom. She also locked me in the attic before she went bananas, in fear that I'd walk down and stop her from enacting her revenge. And would you believe it's been over 20 years? I've worked my ass off to never get on Lacey's bad side. She's a cool chick, and I'm really happy she married my friend. Here's to many more years of happiness. I was leaving a bar in Ballard after a friend's party in February 2021. I hadn't drank that night. I'd been sober for 12 years, and I found that one of the benefits is that you get to take your car home at the end of the night. My car was parked a few blocks down the street. A couple hours earlier, the snow had really started to come down. When it started to stick and accumulate on the railings outside the bar, I decided to give my hugs goodbye and try to make it home. It was close to 2, and the bars would be having their last call any minute. Right now, the sidewalks and roads were empty. I could hear live music and muted laughter from the tinted windows I'd pass, each filled with people who'd soon be hitting the roads. I began to jog, hoping I'd have enough time to beat the clogged-up side streets near the locks. I'd find myself passing one of the entrances closest to the botanical garden. The tall metal fence was closed for the night. It stretches most of that block. A couple feet past the entrance, the other side of the fence gets thick with shrubbery, blocking the view from the outside. I continued to walk on that strip of sidewalk parallel to 54th Street. My eyes once again fixed in front of me. That's when I caught something ahead of me that stopped me in my tracks. A pair of thin arms were reaching out from the bars. Both hands were grabbing at the air, pausing, then again lunging randomly into the sidewalk's path. The lampposts that line this sidewalk are bright. I got close enough to see the nails adorning their fingers were long and black. Before I got too close, I started walking at the edge of the sidewalk, out of reach from these 2 outstretched arms. Just before I cross its path, the arms suddenly jolt backwards, out of view, making a rush of noise as they pulled back through the leaves and away from the bars that separated us. The feeling it gives my stomach reminds me of how it felt walking through my grandma's house at night when I was young. A rising, tingling terror that makes you want to run as fast as you can. The shoes I wore that night were more business attire, and I'd come to discover how terrible they'd be for maneuvering in the snow. I nearly slipped 14 times before I got to my car, but I didn't stop running until I got there. Thankfully, my car was all-wheel drive. I barely got out of there before the roads were unmanageable, almost getting stuck more than once as I got closer to Golden Gardens. I willed myself home, though. There was no way I wanted to encounter what I'd just seen again. I just wanted to get home and forget. But I haven't quite figured out how to forget this one. I work and live in Seattle for about 9 years now. Admittedly, city life can be exhausting, but I'm still a fan of the area. It's easy to get away from the city without going far from it. Usually I try to go hiking and camping several times a month in the summer, and sometimes I bring a few friends along. But this particular weekend, I was out on Bainbridge Island alone, which, for those of you who don't know, is a small island west of Seattle. You can hop on a ferry from the busy city and enter nature's paradise in all of 35 minutes. I wasn't worried about being alone. Done that part many times, and I happen to have spent a good amount of time as a starving artist, so hiking out in the middle of nowhere has kind of become my way of finding inspiration. I always do my best work out there. I mostly draw real things, nature scenes with flowers, trees, insects, and animals. I just want to clarify before I get into my story that I'm not going out there to dream up ghosts or goblins. What I saw the last time, it wasn't my imagination running wild, or too much smoking. Truthfully, I'd never put much thought into the paranormal, or if I believed in any of it. And I put even less thought into aliens. But here, lately, that's all I think about. At first, I lumped them into the same category. Like, if I believed in aliens, I had to believe in all the other stuff too. But that's just not true. There's nothing supernatural at all about the concept that there might be other forms of life out there. The universe is literally endless. The number of solar systems in existence is higher than we can reasonably fathom. It seems impossible that we could believe we're alone in such a vast space. Well, I don't really think we are. Not anymore, anyway. It had been a long day, and I'd just settled into my sleeping bag. I wanted to draw a little before going to bed, but a few minutes later, I saw a strange light from the corner of my eye. When I glanced upwards, something that looked like a huge, pale green star was moving across the sky at a high rate of speed. But it had to be something man-made, because the light was blinking. No, pulsating. It passed directly over me and continued until it was almost out of sight. But at the last second, the object stopped and the light became solid. For a moment, I was afraid that something had noticed me and it was going to come back. But then I watched in utter amazement as an identical green light sprang to life. Where there had been only darkness, there were two of them. The lights sat next to each other for a few minutes before they both began blinking and continued on their way together. I just don't know what could have moved through the sky like that. It was so smooth, so fast, and the way that second one popped up out of nowhere. I can't look up at the sky anymore without wondering if there's more of them up there. I've spent a lot of time reading about other people's experiences with UFOs. And at first, it seemed like no one else in Seattle or Washington were talking about these glowing green orbs. But then I dug deeper, and people have been reporting on orbs for a long time. Maybe they aren't always green, but one that caught my attention was someone in Seattle. They reported seeing something on June 24th, the evening I was out there, and it kind of gave me chills. Quote, pair of iridescent ovals with tendrils and halos travel rapidly at high altitude on southern course across Seattle. Unquote. So I just started searching Bainbridge Island orbs and Seattle orbs, and I got over 286 hits. Things like, quote, 2 glowing reddish, almost see-through orbs flying over the island last night. They stopped in synchronicity mid-flight. Then they continued with immeasurable speed. End quote. Quote, 2 high-flying bright orbs flew over us tonight. Anyone else see those? End quote. And then I found something I'd missed in my initial search for green. Quote, very pretty, bright, lime green, spherical objects moving very fast, in tandem. Sea Bridge Ferry Terminal, halfway across Puget Sound. Look to my right, facing south, to determine ferry's location en route. I observed 2 lights in the night sky, 50 degrees above horizon. 2 lights in formation, stationary. They mirrored the movements of one another, slowly bobbing back and forth, up and down. Became still for only seconds. Then, one sphere shot off onto the direction of the island, while the other remained still for a few seconds before proceeding to do the same. Both spheres appeared and disappeared within seconds. End quote. Could be related, could be absolutely unrelated. Either way, I haven't been able to stop researching, basically. But I don't love everything I read, meaning I don't know how I feel about the different alien races like the Greys, the tall whites, or any of those. But I don't think the concept of other species is all that far-fetched of an idea, and that's kind of unsettling. Even if what I saw wasn't a UFO, I still think there's a good chance that some people have had genuine encounters. I wouldn't be surprised if the world's governments really were covering up their existence, if these races already have the technology to freely travel through space and study other planets. Just think about what their weapons can do. They probably have resources we haven't even dreamed of yet. Really gives you something to think about, doesn't it? I work at a country gas station on a busy highway. Our customers are the people who commute to and from the city for work. Every morning they come in wanting their coffee and biscuits before filling their tanks. And most of them stop for a snack and energy drink in the evening. We get truckers and the random passerbys throughout the day. But those morning and evening rushes are what keep the lights on. Most of the time, it's about the most routine, boring job you can have, unless there's a tornado. I'm in Louisiana. It rains a lot here, and we're known to throw epic hurricane parties. But tornadoes are a pretty rare occurrence for us. During my 35-year lifetime, there's only been 3 in my area. And the first 2 were so far on the other side of town, I didn't even know it was happening until I saw the pictures later. But the 3rd one, that sucker came straight for me. It was a Friday, and I was working with my boss, Ted, and 2 others, Linda and Robbie. We knew the weather was supposed to get rough after lunch, but it was nothing we were concerned about. It was gloomy out, and the rain started just after lunch. The wind was blowing, and the occasional bolt of lightning flashed through the sky. But then it got dark. It looked like the sun was setting, yet it was barely 1 p.m. Then the temperature dropped. It was probably only a few degrees, but you could instantly feel the difference. That was about the time our phone started getting tornado warning alerts. Though actual twisters are rare for us, the warnings are just as uncommon. Every so often, one will be attached to a severe thunderstorm notification. But we're so used to them being false alarms that we don't take them very seriously. But when we looked outside, we all knew this was different. The sky turned downright sinister. I don't think I've ever seen the clouds so close to truly being black. The rain turned to hail. The wind was blowing so hard, it ripped the door from Ted's hand. Robbie stepped outside and lost his hat, as in literally lost it. It blew off of his head and kept on going. When he started to chase after it, Ted grabbed his arm and pulled him back inside. We could actually see the tornado forming in the distance. It dropped down before our very eyes, and it was coming straight for us. Because it was so far down the highway, Linda wanted to jump in her car and try to outrun it, but Ted knew there wasn't enough time to outrun this thing. Ted hollers for all of us to file inside, into the walk-in cooler. At first, Robbie, Linda, and I tried to reason that leaving was the best way. But before we could finish our argument, the tornado was even closer. We definitely didn't have time. As we barricaded ourselves within the cold walk-in, we braced ourselves as a loud rumble got closer and closer to where we were. The rumble was soon accompanied by sounds of thrashing metal, the crashing and cracking of wood, and all of the goods from the store being thrown around, and who knows what else. I've never been in an earthquake, but the way we shook inside that walk-in, it felt like the earth was moving beneath us. Only it wasn't the earth that was moving. It was us. The walk-in was practically being lifted and dropped back down. Small movements, not enough to move us physically up and down, just enough to knock things off the shelves. I could hear Linda whimpering each time it happened. For all of 5 minutes. It just sounded like total destruction was taking place, and in that time, the power completely went out. I think that was the scariest part. I wasn't even paying attention to the racket outside anymore. There was enough going on inside to keep me distracted. With the power out, we could no longer see each other or the items falling off the shelves and onto us. I know at one point I stood up and I cradled my head with my arms, trying to block anything from hitting my head or face. But I could feel coagulated gravy under my feet. It must have been one of the various things to fly off the shelves, and it now covered the ground, making it slippery and impossible to keep balanced. At one point, a heavy plastic container of what I can only assume held potatoes came tumbling down, the corner of the bin smashing one of my fingers, but luckily, not my head. I heard Robbie shriek in pain, but I couldn't see a damn thing. I called out asking if everyone was all right. Ted, Linda, they each gave me a response to indicate that they were conscious. So I told them to cover their heads, hoping they already were, but couldn't be sure. My eyes were tightly shut for what felt like forever, but soon, and I mean, it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes after it all started, everything was scary quiet. There was no wind, no rain, no sound of flying debris. There was only the sound of our own breathing, which by this time was pretty heavy. We stayed in that walk-in until it got too hot to handle. Ted was the first one out. It took all of us to get the door opened, but eventually we broke through the debris on the other side, and as soon as he walked through to the other side, he gasped. The rest of us shuffled out quickly behind him, and involuntarily did just the same. Truly, we couldn't believe what we saw. Nothing. The entire store which housed the walk-in cooler was gone. Not just the roof, not just the walls, but everything had been completely gutted. The goods on the shelves, the register, the coolers, all of it was thrown into various piles of unrecognizable junk. Our cars had been completely flipped around, no longer in their designated spots behind the building that no longer stood. We aren't even sure to this day where the little motorbike ended up. The only thing still standing, practically untouched, was the walk-in. By God's good graces, and probably Ted's good thinking, we survived against all odds. Eventually, Linda remembered she'd taken a bag into the cooler, filled with our cell phones. I grabbed my cell phone from the bag and called emergency services, while she poured over the damage with Ted and Robbie. As I waited to get through, I remember thinking it was odd we hadn't heard a single siren throughout the ordeal or since it ended. When someone answered and I explained our location, the woman on the line was shocked. It was clear that they had assumed there were no survivors in the area, especially no one from the store, which was no longer standing. It wasn't immediate, but soon enough we heard the sound of something that's usually not so sweet. the sound of sirens. The store was a total loss, and there'd be a lot of rebuilding to do, but at least we were alive. Every year at the end of May, the family decides on a vacation destination. A few years ago, we planned our trip to the Grand Canyon. It was going to be 3 days of camping, hiking, and outdoor adventures with my daughter, Peyton, who was 6. She's a girly girl, and most of what she packed in her suitcase were princess dresses and Barbies. She was horrified when I showed her the big, cumbersome hiking boots that she'd be wearing most likely the whole trip, as opposed to her plastic Beauty and the Beast slippers that she'd wear religiously around the house. We also couldn't leave without her packing her pink Barbie Jeep. Thankfully, we've got a big enough SUV, but loading and unloading was a nightmare in itself, but I won't bother you with the details of that. Let's just say by the time we got to our campground, the 6-hour trip had worn on all of our patience. As me and Casey set up the tents, Peyton was exploring off the beaten path in her Jeep. Our campground was mostly flat and rocky, with trees scattered about every couple of feet. The terrain felt like a desert, and the few trees scattered about didn't bring any needed shade. Later in the afternoon, we're getting the fire started, and Peyton runs up to us with a huge smile on her face. In a burst of giddy excitement, she tells us that she's seen a beautiful blue fairy dancing by the trees. Her nose scrunches up, and she says she's going to try to catch it. Casey and I share a laugh at our dusty princess and her fun imagination. Peyton's grown up in the city. Our confined location means that we have to get creative with our resources to have a good time. Out camping, she was free to run wild. I got out her butterfly net from our gear bag, and I told her not to go too far. With determination in her heart, she grabs the net, hops back into her Jeep, and speeds off, kicking up rocks and dirt with her plastic tires. Honestly, it was a real cinematic moment. With the terrain being so level, she could get a couple 100 yards away with her still being within eyesight. Around that range, she stops her Jeep and begins searching for the elusive fairy she'd just seen. Net in hand, we watch her begin to stalk around the trees. We think she's going to be occupied with that hunt for a while. So Casey and I throw a few more logs on the fire and prepare some dinner. We bought a little grated cooking top that we could put directly over the fire and started cooking up some burger patties. We're sitting in our lawn chairs. I'm having a beer and the food is about to be done on the fire. And Casey's keeping us cool by spritzing the air with an iced water spray bottle. In the distance, she sees the Barbie Jeep making its way towards us. She tells me Peyton's coming back. Then Casey says, it looks like she caught something too. I look and I see Peyton. She has the pedal to the metal, with the butterfly net held above her head in a victorious pose. I'm running the grill, so Casey's the one who meets Peyton first when she arrives. I listen in on her story. She says, I saved the fairy from a giant spider. The fairy was flying away from me and tried hiding in a hole, but the big spider was in there. They both popped out of the hole. It looked like the spider was winning, so I kicked it to save the fairy. Then I got her with the net. Oh, my fearless little girl. The story is enough to make me leave the burgers and walk over to her and Casey and see the fairy that she saved. Even before digging into the net, I could see something hopping around. The sound of its fluttering wings reminded me of a moth, but louder. Peyton says, Look, Daddy, and opens the white mesh netting. It was unwise of me to then enthusiastically lean my head over the open net, because in retrospect, I knew a fairy wasn't going to be in that net. I don't know why I did it. As my grinning face eclipsed the hole of the butterfly net, it blocked the escape of the flying creature. Like seeing a rock hit your windshield, it moved too fast for my eyes to process, and it hit me in the face before I could move out of its way. When I throw my head back, my hands instinctively swipe at what's on my face, but before I can make contact with it, Peyton's fairy stings me on the left side of the cheek, with a stinger large enough for me to feel its penetration. Then, within a blink, the worst searing pain I've ever felt in my entire life filled my face. It's to this day the most excruciating pain I've ever felt on any part of my body. I've been hit in the face with fists, baseballs, and even a bowling ball growing up. None of these, not even the bowling ball that literally caved my nasal cavity, nothing compared to the pain I felt that day. It was mind-numbing. All I could do was fall backwards and scream. It felt like someone heated a railroad spike until it was red hot, then started hammering it into my cheek. I can feel the venom working its way through my bloodstream. It radiates down my spine, and I can feel each of my muscles begin to constrict. My ears were ringing. I'd screamed the air out of my lungs, and in between me taking another breath, I could hear Peyton and Casey also screaming their lungs out and running around me. I can't move my neck. It's as if I'm paralyzed down to my shoulders. All I can do is kick my legs. It swells the whole left side of my face, and the stabbing pain continues to hit me full force. Minutes feel like hours, but as the torment slowly begins to recede, the ringing in my ears subsides, and I can hear Casey on the phone with emergency services. They're getting ready to send a helicopter out to airlift me to the hospital. But I waved at her not to do that. My left eye was swollen shut, and the pain was still throbbing, but I knew I wasn't dying. Casey would have to drive us all the way out of the canyon, but we didn't need an airlift. For a moment, though, I sure thought that I was dying. The sting area was red and left an ache for the remainder of the day. After this thing dropped me, Casey said that she soaked it with a spray bottle and wet its wings, then stomped it. When I got to see what actually got me, I was astonished. I'd never seen an insect this big in real life. I mean, I could understand how a 6-year-old could mistake this for a fairy. I know Peyton hadn't seen anything like this either. To give an idea of its size, do this. Open your hand and spread all 5 fingers as wide as possible. From the gap between your pointer and thumb to your pinky is how large it was. The curve of your hand is also how it was shaped. The blue fairy Peyton introduced us to was actually an insect, specifically a type of wasp called the tarantula hawk. I don't know who's more traumatized by this, honestly. Peyton hadn't really stopped talking about the time Daddy almost died at the Grand Canyon. But I'm still plagued with nightmares that I find their nest. They chase me until I wake up. I can still hear their heavy wings after I'm awake. My left cheek still has a red small dot that resembles a freckle where the venom destroyed cell tissue, scarring me. I thought I was gonna die that day. I accidentally terrified Peyton away from her fantasy interest. I think a little bit of her still thinks that a fairy tried to murder me. My dad once volunteered to pick my girlfriend up from the airport after I broke my leg in a skiing accident. This story is told from their accounts. It was near 11 p.m., and my dad, Russ, was sitting in his car waiting for my girlfriend, Via, to get off the flight. Russ had been sitting there for a while, and the left taillight of the car in front of him had been blinking and flashing randomly. It flittered in blinks, and then he watched a physical spark ignite inside the taillight. It's an older Plymouth, and Russ assumes that it's just wiring. He continues to watch it, though, in case another spark decides to become a flame. Via gets into my dad's car, and right behind her are a couple more passengers from the plane. One is an older man that gets into the passenger seat of the Plymouth. Both cars are pulling out of the arrival lot at the same time. There's a couple mile of highway leaving the airport before getting back to the freeway. The whole time they're following the car with a burnt-out taillight. Then all of the lights in the back end of the Plymouth begin to malfunction. At first, they're watching this light show thinking it's a shame. They're probably going to get pulled over and have no idea why. But then they see the right tail light pop out from the back and bounce on the road, nearly crashing through their windshield. Russ would swerve last minute to avoid the object that was hurling toward them. The highway that they're traveling is a single lane, grass hills on either side. If Russ hadn't been able to correct the car when he fishtailed, Via and him would probably have been killed if they went off that hill at the speed they were going. When the cars aligned right behind the Plymouth again, their shared anger dissipates into horror as they watch the arm of a small child start to reach out from the hole made in the rear taillight. The arm looks frail or bloody or bruised, all three. They've got it stretched out to their shoulder and they're waving desperately for help. Russ reaches for his cell phone to call the police, but it's dead. Via's phone is almost dead too, but she manages to get the phone call connected long enough to describe the car and part of its license plate. She told them where they were, what they were seeing. When the cars got onto the freeway, the Plymouth picked up speed, and Russ was unable to maintain visuals on the car. He and Via would eventually give up the pursuit 20 miles past their original exit. When they got home and could charge their phones, they filed an official report. They even tried to get information as to if the Plymouth was ever caught or not. We were never able to figure out what happened, but we pray that the police were able to locate the car and help whoever was in the trunk. My parents separated when I was 5, so my memories of when Bio Dad lived with us are fuzzy and incomplete, but I've been told things could get pretty bad. Jim had a serious drug problem. He would take anything he could get his hands on, but meth was his favorite. When he was low on cash, which was quite often, he'd just cook up a batch and sell as much as he could to get by. In case there's anyone who doesn't know, cooking meth is dangerous. It can literally explode. People blow themselves up trying to make it all the time. Needless to say, Mom wasn't very happy when she caught him cooking the stuff in our attic. There were a million other reasons she left him, but that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Only Jim didn't want to get divorced. He said wedding vows were forever, that if she tried to leave anyway, she would never see me again. Well, that just doubled her resolve. She waited for him to pass out after a big bender, packed our bags, and drove us to Grandma's house almost 2 hours away. Then she left me there and drove all the way back while her brother followed in his van. Jim was still passed out, and Mom knew that he would stay that way into the next day unless someone intervened. After confirming that there were still drugs in the house, they loaded up our car and Uncle Hank's van with as much stuff as they could before calling the police. They didn't know what kind of response to expect, but they were worried they wouldn't be allowed to take anything else once the cops arrived. My uncle waited in a Walmart parking lot. He wasn't a drug dealer, but let's just say he wasn't exactly flying the straight and narrow. He didn't want to cause any trouble for Mom if the police decided to run his name. Things actually went pretty smoothly, all things considered. Jim was rudely awakened from his slumber, and any hope of expressing his anger was completely ruined by the horde of police tearing his house apart. Unfortunately, there was no present evidence that proved he cooked the drugs himself. That would have added a nice chunk of years to his sentence, but he still served 3 years when all was said and done. During that time, Mom remarried, and we moved to a different state where I started school. Not too long after my 7th birthday, Mom learned that Jim would be released in the upcoming months. She didn't think that he would be able to find us and therefore didn't want to scare me for no reason. To this day, she still apologizes for that mistake. Sure enough, Jim was able to find us without too much of a struggle. One day he showed up while I was at recess. This is the 80s, by the way. Security was not the same back then. And he says that he has to take me home because Mom had an accident. I had no clue that he'd been in prison. At that age, I probably didn't even fully understand the concept of it. I just thought my parents got a divorce, and I happened to live with my mom. Jim was now making it sound like because of Mom's accident, only he was allowed to get me from school. I should have known better. My stepdad picked me up all the time, but I was so terrified of losing my mom that I couldn't think of anything else. I just wanted to get to her. I followed Jim right off the playground and hopped into his back seat without making a peep. It didn't even occur to me to talk to a teacher before leaving. Once we were off the school grounds, our speed began accelerating at a terrifying rate. I was already crying silently. The sudden erratic driving scared me to hysterics. While crossing the highway, a big truck had to slam on its brakes to avoid T-boning us. I screamed, and Jim smacked me upside the head. He said if I didn't stop crying, he would make me ride in the trunk. I remember looking around to see that we had left the heavy traffic behind us and feeling a little bit better. I took the opportunity to ask what happened to Mom, but Jim just cranked up whatever tape he was listening to. That's when I started to take a closer look at my surroundings. I hadn't recognized the road that we were on, but I knew one of the ones that came right after it, and we missed the turn for my house. That's when I got really scared. I thought Mom was hurt so badly that she had to go to the hospital. What if Jim was driving like this because he had to get me there before she died? I began crying all over again, lost in mindless nightmares about how awful life would be without a mom. I didn't even notice how much time was passing, but altogether, he had me for over an hour, so it must have been about that long. Then, all of a sudden, there were flashing lights behind us. They'd been announcing a description of us in Jim's car on the local radio stations. Had he been listening to those instead of a cassette, he might have chosen to get off the road, and things could have ended very differently. As it was, a few different people stopped to call the police after spotting us along the way. The police found a map in the driver door. Our route had been traced out, and we were only 20 minutes from reaching our destination, an old landfill. Jim also had a shovel, knew that he could never win custody of me, so he decided to take me away from my mom, the only way that he knew how. That got him a considerably longer sentence than the first, but he died of an overdose in prison just 5 years later. I can't say that I'm sorry. Last year, I lived in a furnished apartment across town for almost 6 months while waiting for repairs to be completed in my actual apartment building. There wasn't very many people living in my building at the time, so only a few of these units were occupied by people from my same building. The rest were just residents who lived there full-time. The apartment itself was more like a studio, so a little smaller than I was used to, but it was really nice and really clean. I actually started to quite enjoy the space while I was there. It sat up against a greenbelt or a wetland of some kind. You could hear a constant stream of water. There was a small balcony where you could sit maybe 2 people comfortably, so I liked to sit out there during the hot summer nights. You could hear the nature over the sound of traffic in this spot, thanks to that stream. During the day, you would hear birds, small critters, you'd see deer. In the night, it was the sound of owls, coyotes, but also a symphony of sounds created by the various bugs and frogs that occupied the wetland. Part of me didn't want to leave this place, but this is early in, maybe 2 months. When the fall started to approach, things changed. I mean, technically for me, everything changed. I can't even think about the woods the same, let alone see them without wondering, is that thing in there? It was just after Labor Day, the first cool day that we'd had since June. It finally felt decent inside, but it felt even better outside with the breeze. I remember thinking that the moon looked exceptionally large that night. Beautiful, but larger than life, and acting as a giant nightlight for the evening. When I recall what happens next, it feels like my eyes were temporarily closed. I was listening to the sounds. They were soothing, until they went mute. Aside from the stream, everything went quiet at the same time. I opened my eyes and looked towards the green belt. I wondered why the sound had suddenly ceased, but I couldn't explain it. Then, just as I thought I'd give it no more thought, a loud wailing began. I'd never heard anything like this in real life, and as much as I wanted to blame it on a neighbor's loud television or their idea of a joke, I knew the sound came from outside. It came from the very green belt I was so fond of. A moment later, I heard the balcony door to my left open, and I saw a man lean over. He was from my original building, a guy named Sam, who was about 27, like myself. He asked if I'd heard that noise and if I thought it sounded like a scream. I told him I'd never heard anything like that. If it was a scream, what was screaming like that? He was about to say something when the loud wailing sounded again, absolutely closer this time. It was the only sound I could hear, and I had a bad feeling about it. I didn't hear Sam go inside, but he was gone when I had the nerve to peek over the side and whisper his name. I was alone out there, and so I decided to stand up and slowly make my way inside. But when I did, I saw more of the green belt. I saw something larger than anything I'd ever seen, not just in this area, but in the woods in general. Sure, I don't go backpacking every weekend, but I'm familiar with the wildlife in my state. In this area, this thing stood as tall as some of the young trees, but its girth, it could have taken those trees from their roots. I couldn't tell if the thing had fur. I didn't know if it was a giant human or I don't know. But I eventually saw it see me. Before, I couldn't be sure where it was facing, but the presence of two glowing red eyes suddenly appeared where this thing's head should be. I felt legitimately frozen. I knew if I really tried, I could likely move or even look away, but it was like I couldn't try too hard, or wouldn't. The strange sensation of being terrified, yet not trying to move. I couldn't understand it, even as I was doing it. I remember thinking, where's the moon's brightness? Why won't it show me what I'm looking at? The longer I stared, the more everything sort of dispersed. Everything besides these two red eyes, or whatever they were. Then I didn't feel those things anymore. And even though I can still remember as much detail as I provided here, I still feel like I'm missing something. Like, I don't remember the eyes going away. I don't understand what happened, and I don't understand what I saw. I just know from then on I was eager to get back to my apartment. Well-lit streets, busy sounds of traffic. I suddenly missed the view of the theater from my apartment building. The neon sign used to sort of bother me, but after that moment, I longed for the light. So, I guess I'm just one of those people who's of the personal opinion that there are strange things in the woods, and it's probably not just here in the Pacific Northwest. We had a neighbor in Michigan who passed away in such a peculiar manner. The oddity of it all really shook our small community. It was the early 80s. Most kids had curfews after the streetlights turned on. In the area I lived in, we were told to get inside before the sun set. In grade school is where I learned about Bloody Mary. Me and my friends would try to scare each other by saying that we really saw her in the mirror. When we would have sleepovers, we would take turns going into the dark bathroom, staring into the mirror and saying Bloody Mary 3 times. Each of us would burst from the bathroom and swear on everything that our fictitious story of what we saw was the God's honest truth. Then a kid that goes to our school went missing. Sniffer dogs would find his head and torso in a field. Reports said that there were large bite marks on the body, but they couldn't distinguish if they occurred pre- or post-death. As our parents tried to grasp meaning from the senseless tragedy, word spread around school that Bloody Mary got him. It was most likely a serial killer, as 2 more bodies of missing kids would be found around the Great Lake area within the same month. But none of them were quite as horrific or visceral as what happened to our classmate. The other bodies were intact. They'd been strangled and assaulted. The body of our classmate was completely ripped apart. The adults started coming up with their own theories, attempting to understand it all. At a town hall meeting, a farmer was mocked when he started talking about a giant black creature killing his livestock north of the field where they found the boy. But then, amidst the laughter and chatter, another voice speaks up from somewhere in the room, claiming they've also seen something dark as night running through the trees around his backyard. He described it as a wolf with eyes and teeth of a shark. As the crowd begins to steadily hush, more and more people come forward with accounts, all describing the same thing. After that meeting, a small group of willing men gathered weapons and flashlights, then went looking for whatever was in those woods. They combed all around the forest in ATVs all night and into the next day. One of the hunters claimed to have seen a dim, glowing ball of light following behind him while he was riding through the trees. It stayed behind him for a couple of miles, then went super fast past him, like a clap of lightning in the dark. None of the other men could confirm his story, though, because they'd all gone in separate directions trying to cover as much land as possible. A year would go by without an attack, then another and another. The town would eventually be able to reclaim its calm, pastoral feel and heal. Some still fully believe that it was an otherworldly being that visited the town, and some will claim that it was the work of a deranged serial killer that was caught years ago.